Everybody watching on Twitch, say hello to Anna Wolfe of Mississippi today. Anna, thank you for coming on. I'm going to jump right into it here.
Sure.
You are credited with breaking the Brett Favre story, and I'm just curious, as a member of the media who does some fair share of digging himself, what put this on your radar? Like, how did you find out about Brett Favre being involved in the largest welfare scandal that arguably the country's ever seen?
Yeah, it's kind of more simple than it sounds because in early 2020, the state auditor arrested 6 people in connection with this embezzlement scheme to take money from the state's Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, or welfare. And one of the companies that they funneled that money to was named in the indictments. That company was Provacus, and it didn't take too long to figure out who was attached to Provacus. I mean, there's any number of articles about Brett Favre's promotion of this company. He invested himself in the company. And so it wasn't a far leap to connect him to that company. And then I just put in a records request to the Department of Human Services, the welfare agency that administers this money, for any emails related to Brett Favre, that named Brett Favre in any way. And that came back. Really what it was a calendar invite that said that it was from the director of the agency, saying that the governor and Brett Favre had asked him to meet with them about concussion research, which is what that company was doing.
Mm-hmm. And for those that don't know, and as Anna alluded to, Provacus is essentially a company that Brett Favre teamed up with a neuroscientist, though Mark Fainaru-Wada of ESPN investigated a little bit, and there's some clunky, I guess you could say, missing pieces as to his credibility in the field. Some would say that he had a higher up position. Many would counter that when he was at Emory and also, I believe, BU. But they basically wanted to create a concussion drug. But here's my thing, and I'll throw it back to you, is they were selling this left and right. They put out the full court press of how Provacus is going to be this thing when it wasn't even on the market. Would that also be a humongous red flag?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there were a lot of red flags within the development of this drug. I mean, I think that there's been some good reporting. I think ESPN did a really good story kind of talking to people about like what is the likeliness that this drug is a thing, right? I
Right.
mean, it hasn't gone through trials. I mean, if you talk to the guy who founded the company, he still says that they're working on it and that they're making their way through trials. But what they were trying to do in Mississippi makes it all the more interesting to me because they were suggesting that they would be able to come here and do human trials in Mississippi and actually manufacture the drug here, which is how they kind of turned it into this is an economic development opportunity for the state of Mississippi.
Right. And if people are unaware, that company right now is based in Florida. It is
Mhm.
not in Mississippi. Okay, so if we're going back to the very beginning, I want to clear up something because I remember seeing this and my eyes just opened wide, which is honestly a theme, if we're being honest here. But one thing that caught my eye was through your reporting that there was allegedly a exchange of $5 million in cash in the very beginning from one meeting. Is that accurate?
The promise to put $4 million into this, and now you're talking about the volleyball stadium,
Yes, I
correct?
am. Yes.
So, and that was kind of one of the major breakthroughs that I had right in the beginning, right after the arrests. I made that connection between Provacus and Brett Favre and found out that Brett Favre was actually talking to state officials about getting funding to this company. And then pretty quickly, right after that, I had learned that the volleyball stadium at University of Southern Mississippi, that Brett Favre was also promoting and trying to get people to invest in, and really kind of took credit for getting it built in the media.
Mm-hmm.
That was actually paid for with welfare money, and so that took a public records request to the university for any agreements, any contracts or anything between the university and this nonprofit that we already knew that all the money was funneling through that nonprofit. And that's when I got the lease agreement back that said that the nonprofit was going to put up $5 million in cash to essentially rent athletic facilities at the university, including the volleyball stadium that had yet to be built, in exchange for, the money to build the volleyball stadium. And it was sort of in the contract itself, it says, I say contract, I mean the lease agreement itself, it says that this is a building that will be utilized to perform services for underprivileged people. And anyone either reading stories about the construction of the facility or anyone who knew anything about that facility knew that that was not taking place there, and there never really was going to be an effort to do that there.
100%. Now, for those that are also unaware, just a quick filler here, from top to bottom, there are the major players who are the former governor, Phil Bryant, who was preceded by Tate Reeves. Many people know him on the network. There's also John Davis, head of DHS, Nancy New, who ran the Mississippi Community Education Center. And then there are the other major players like Brett Favre, the DiBiase's, what have you. What I find to be interesting, and maybe you could tell me, is they really sold this volleyball facility as helping people. And I'm not trying to be simplistic about this, but doesn't it seem like for a state that is one of the worst when it comes to allocating federal money to help those in need, they were building this up as it would help people, yet it seems like the most helpful way to support their citizens and their constituents would be to provide them with food, to provide them with housing, to put food on their plates, to help them with gas money and what have you. Like, how could this have possibly slipped through the cracks that a volleyball facility would help people who are trying to get welfare money?
Yeah, absolutely. So you say that, they were trying to build this thing up like it was going to help people in poverty. And I don't think that they ever believed that. They didn't advertise that, right? That wasn't like something that they told the public about, that we were going to use welfare money to build this. So that kind of gives you an idea that they knew that they were doing something behind closed doors, and they were kind of using the idea of this being a wellness center,
right,
as a pretext to getting money to construct the facility. So I don't think that was a genuine or that wasn't a reasonable argument for doing that. It's just that that's how they could on paper get away with it,
right,
based on the way that the welfare program is set up federally, which is that states can essentially use the money on anything that they want with no federal oversight, as long as they can say that it helps someone in poverty. And there is no requirement that the state provide any outcomes or any reporting that shows that what they're doing is actually helping people or solving poverty. And that's how they got away with it. And I guess I'll say too that I got on this story initially long before the arrests occurred, because I knew that the state wasn't using the money for those things that you just mentioned. I knew that they weren't providing cash, for example, cash assistance to very poor families. There was a statistic that came out back in 2017 that said that the state was approving just 1.5% of applicants who were applying for cash welfare. So I knew that the money wasn't going to families, and I had talked to enough of them and enough advocates and service providers in the community to know that that's not how they were spending the money. And that's when I started really pushing the agency and trying to get records for how they were spending the money, and kind of hit roadblock after roadblock until finally the arrests were made.
I suppose, and this is obviously a sarcastic question, but one of our commenters, Real Astadad, says, so volleyball is not solving poverty? No, it is not solving poverty. I suppose I need to go back to something. When we're talking about federally allocated money, you went through the process, right, of how they obtain the money and what they do with it. Why are there so many loopholes within this system that they don't have to report how they're spending it?
So the idea in the beginning when this program was created during welfare reform in the 90s, that was under Bill Clinton, right? The idea was that welfare as we had been administering it, which is in through entitlements, right? Like actual aid to people, was trapping people in poverty, right? Was creating dependence on the government. And so instead of doing that, they wanted to turn it into a block grant so that states had broad flexibility to spend the money however they best saw fit for their residents. So like people are dealing with different things in different states. And so the idea was that states should be given the flexibility to address the needs as they saw them, instead of the federal government telling them what to do. And, that's just the way it was written. And I mean, I don't think that you can argue that, like, I think it's pretty clear that it was set up in the beginning to basically give states a slush fund for their governors to spend any way that they want.
Yes. That's at least how I would perceive it, and I know many would perceive it as well. If someone were to say and be a staunch defender of a Hall of Fame quarterback because they were a huge fan of what that person meant to them and how much the Green Bay Packers might mean to them, and they were to continue defending Brett Favre left and right and say there's no way he knew, he basically saying the media is smearing him, how would you counter that to that person?
Anyone who wants to defend Brett Favre in what he did, in the influence that he wielded over officials to move this money away from people in poverty to his pet projects, is that anyone making that argument, they're a person who doesn't believe in cash welfare or welfare programs or anti-poverty programs. I mean, these are people who, from my experience, they don't think that the money is going to be used properly anyway. And so like, if you're defending Brett Favre, those arguments almost go hand in hand with like the people who say that, oh, well, the people in poverty were just going to misspend the money anyway. Right. It's the idea that, that money, they don't want to see that money going to people in poverty. And so they don't really care where it goes, if it goes to build a volleyball stadium or something else.
Right.
I think anyone who cares about poverty and putting programs in place to help people in poverty, you can't really defend him.
I've seen a lot of his text messages. Some of them, if I'm being very honest about this, is amateur. Like I told a friend this. I texted my high school drug dealer better than Brett Favre texted some of these people. Like the dropping Santa cash off in the office, like that is just that is minor leagues. A lot of the other texts that I saw between him and Governor Bryant. What I will say though is, it seems like there is a way of thinking, in my opinion, with more savvy politicians that I didn't see a lot of text messages with Tate Reeves, and towards the end, it really felt like Governor Bryant knew the more he texted, the worse it could get. So he really wanted to keep these things out of like a text exchange, purely a text exchange. If someone were to be just tuning in for the first time, what do you believe would be potentially anything that could happen with Brett Favre? Some people want, let's be clear about this. Humans are humans. Some people want him to go to prison. Some people really want to see him suffer. And others are saying maybe he'll just get off with a fine. What say you?
So, I mean, he's being charged civilly right now. He has not faced criminal charges. The civil charges do ask him to repay this money. And I think that getting some of the money back for people in Mississippi is a form of justice in this situation. I think that, people have their different ideas about what justice looks like. And certainly people want to see him face consequences that is, beyond just him having to repay money that he allegedly, stole or misspent. So the criminal investigation is ongoing, and you see that the defendants who have pleaded guilty so far have agreed to aid the prosecution in the ongoing investigation. And I think that, if you had to say who the federal authorities have their sights set on, I think that Phil Bryant is a pretty good guess of, who they would be looking for, who that bigger fish is. And Phil Bryant's closest connections to any misspending that occurred during the scandal are the purchases that benefited Brett Favre. So I think that if you see Phil Bryant being investigated, I think that it's not a far leap to say that Brett Favre would be included in that probe. But the feds work really slowly and quietly, and we just don't know where they're at on that.
What was the most egregious thing that you saw welfare money spent on in your reporting on this story?
The volleyball stadium just stands out because the amount of money. I don't think that you've seen a single purchase that large, sure. Any larger than $5 million to actually construct a building is pretty egregious. I think that the payments to the wrestlers are really interesting in what they say about the state's mentality about people in poverty. So if you go beyond just this money was misspent, okay, well, like, what was it actually spent on? What was actually done in exchange for the money in some cases? The wrestlers in some cases did do work for the welfare department, right? And that work was essentially putting on self-help courses to state employees and welfare employees that they were then planning to replicate with welfare clients. And I mean, just the how patronizing that is, right? Mm-hmm. To people living in poverty, that this wrestler is who is very wealthy from his career is telling them how to, pull up their bootstraps. And meanwhile, he's making $3 million putting these courses on from welfare money. I mean, it's just like you couldn't write it in a novel,
There have been, don't get me wrong, it seems like a plethora of terrible moments throughout this story. Do not get me wrong. One of the most egregious, which really got to me because we cover prison labor, prison reform, what have you. Also, in my own piece, there's a owner for the Detroit Pistons who says, I want criminal justice reform. He was in the thick of the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer of 2020, yet he owns a company called Securus, which overcharges prison phone calls where people basically, you're nodding your head. I mean, people know this stuff that we covered previously. So that's one thing that really got to me. But then seeing Brett Favre say, well, maybe for the lockers, we could use prison labor. Like that, there have been so many terrible moments, and yet seeing how he gets so much money and he obviously made over $130 million in his playing career, but then he also wants to cut a corner with prison labor in order to build lockers really shows like how they thought about this, how they could preserve as much as they can and not spend really anything on the labor.
Right. And, I think that a lot of people who are tuning into the story, they're really hung up on the, is this a crime element of it? And,
right.
That's where they really hone in on, did he know that it was TANF money? Right. That seems to be like a sticking point for people. And I don't think it matters if he even knew what temporary assistance for needy families is, when you see the kind of workarounds that he was doing to get around what he knew to be prohibitions on the use of this money, because he even says in one text, is this getting around the brick and mortar prohibition? He uses the term brick and mortar, which is, from the federal statutes on TANF. But I think, focusing on whether it's a crime or not, it's still a story for me, whether it's a crime or not.
Yeah.
And it just speaks to, I think, the level of protection that he felt that he had, being the celebrity that he is in Mississippi, that he could get away with using this money in this way. And to your point about the prison contracts, all of this speaks to me to the big business of poverty, right? Like
Yeah.
we ask ourselves how there can be so much poverty in a state or country with so many resources. And like, let's not forget that people are making money off of poverty. People are making money off of people in poverty. And this is like the clearest example of that to me.
I agree. On another point, one thing that also stuck out to me is obviously, as we're going through um, litigation and each side is putting out text messages that they want to show absolve them. Now, look, if we were to somehow get the entire trove, no one would look good. But this is what we have right now. This is what we have to work off. One thing that really stuck out to me was the former, I believe, president at USM, who Rodney Bennett, who said, like, he basically said in a text message that he doesn't agree with how Brett Favre is going about this. So there were other people who definitely knew that this was wrong. You're having a former president at Brett Favre's alma mater, at Nancy New's alma mater, at Governor Bryant's alma mater, at John Davis's alma mater, basically saying, I don't like the way that Brett Favre is going about this. And he clearly wanted out in this. Could he possibly be called to testify or be a witness in any of the ongoing litigation?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think like when we get to the deposition stage of the civil litigation, you're going to see all kinds of people from USM called to answer questions about what happened. It was primarily people from the athletics department, who were actually in the room, actually in the meetings where this money was committed, and they were talking about the ways that they could get around, the restrictions on this grant money. And there were text messages too where Favre was relaying concerns that he had heard from officials at USM that they were really scared about taking this money for good reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then all the attorneys got together and they assured each other that it was okay and that it was going to fly. And so I think the attorneys are really, I would say, at risk, of being called into question because they're the ones that are giving the legal guidance that this is okay for the state to do. Yeah. That's what I'd say about that.
So a few more questions for you. One thing that really stuck out to me was Brett has now pulled this twice, if we're keeping count, with a volleyball stadium. He did it previously through his charities Far for Hope, when his daughter, who also attended USM when he wanted to help construct this $5 million volleyball facility. He also did this when she was at, I believe, Oak Grove High School, where he would funnel money from his charity called Far for Hope, which he started to help out the community. His wife, Deanna, had breast cancer. He put on baseball games. He put all this stuff, the whole 9 yards. But then the biggest payments he would make from Far for Hope, his own charity that he started to help out people, was then funneled into the volleyball facility at Oak Grove High School. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around this here. Like, you have a pattern of not doing the right thing. He was caught now doing this for USM. We go back, we look at his charities. This is clearly a track record, right? That like
Absolutely.
anybody could use against him.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there are like major like IRS questions with his charity, right? That he should be called out on. And it wasn't just the volleyball stadium, the indoor stadium at Southern Miss. Once his daughter moved over to the beach volleyball team, he got a sand court constructed as well. He actually moved his commitment to the volleyball stadium, the personal commitment that he made over to the sand stadium. So just anything that he could do to not have to pony up his own money, right?
Yeah.
Like he'll commit money in the beginning to get a project off the ground or make people think that he's serious about getting something done in the community, but then doesn't pony up. And I think that with what you're talking about at the high school, that there are some people, from what I understand, there were people left holding the bag on that too.
Right. As a journalist, and I've told you this off air, but also the work you are doing is phenomenal, and I hope you win all the awards in the world. As a journalist, what has been the hardest part for you?
Uh, well, that's an interesting question. I mean, certainly there's like parts of the work that is very, very difficult, getting people to own up to things and when you're up against an agency that you need answers from and they're gaslighting you and making you feel like your questions are silly or that you don't understand what you're talking about and send you things in response to records requests that don't make any sense and on and on and on, right? Um, I mean, certainly like the work is difficult. I've really enjoyed seeing the story get the attention that I think it deserves. And I understand that Brett Favre being a part of it, like, unfortunately, is, probably the only reason that so many people know about the story. But if that's what it took to, the money wasn't going to go to people in poverty regardless. I knew that from 2017 on, right? So the fact that it is getting so much attention, I'm really glad for.
Definitely. My hope is with Brett Favre's involvement that more people undoubtedly are starting to pay attention to this, but that the players who are involved with funneling this money that is supposed to go to our neighbors that need it the most might start having second thoughts. And I know that that is probably wishful thinking 99 times out of 100, but I do feel like that this is gaining some serious momentum, and I am truly hopeful that we will have some sort of progressed oversight on this entire thing. Although I remain quite doubtful and pessimistic, this is huge. With or without Brett Favre, it has become huge. One more question for you. Is there one thing that you feel like has not received as much shine as it should through your reporting on this story?
Well, certainly, like, this, everyone is focused on the way that these players involved have funneled this money to all these egregious things, but like the system as it is set up was designed to divert money away from people in poverty. And so like the policies in place and the system itself at the Department of Human Services makes it so that people cannot get help, and that system hasn't really changed, right? So you can get out the fraud and send people to jail, but the system itself hasn't changed and still isn't helping people in the best way that it could, isn't focused on drawing people out of poverty. And I also want to say that, like, this story has blown up so much, and it's so big because of how surprising it is to people, right? The fact that Brett Favre could have influence over state officials in a way to divert money in this way. But like, I can tell you that the experts that I talk to are people who are either on welfare or have tried to apply for welfare. Those are the people on the ground who are not surprised at all by this because they already knew it was going on. They knew that the system had been hijacked. And so the fact that it was Brett Favre didn't really come as any surprise to them that, this rich white celebrity would be the one benefiting from it, because they knew that that was happening all along. So I think that one lesson that we can learn from this story is to listen to people, who are facing these hardships, because they know better than anyone what's going on.
Without a doubt. And maybe to add on to that, one of the most egregious examples, and also shows how connected they are, is Brett Favre, through text messages, made a recommendation for some doctor to get on a chiropractor board just through word of mouth because he was friends with him. So there are so many different angles to the story. I really appreciate your time, and if anybody wants to see it, please do check out Mississippi Today and continue following Anna Wolfe's work because it is so incredibly important. Anna, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.